Hey, Sean from AdventuresInArchery.com again. Welcome to the 6th video in my Learn Archery Like a Mameluke companion series. I'm pretty excited for today's video because after all the work with the bow, we finally add arrows. This video covers nocking and now truly completing your draw. There's a link to the guide page in the description below if you need it. For today's video, you'll need your braced bow, thumb protection if you want, a belt, and a single unfletched arrow with your draw length marked on it. And don't forget your practice mirror. Now, the guide covers how to use a cinch type belt to hold your arrows, but a hook type works too. Just get it tight and sink that arrow to about 1/3 of its length. Now, nocking arrows is the 5th Saracen archery fundamental, and Mamelukes were meant to do it blindingly fast, on a horse, in combat, and all the while never once looking at the arrow or the bowstring. That's pretty intense, and we can get there too with practice. First, you're going to need to pick up that arrow. And remember, if you were getting ready to loose an arrow, your grasping arm would already be extended. How you want to start is take your draw hand, close the bottom 2 fingers. Now, use your index, middle finger, and thumb to pick up the arrow at about 2/3 back from the arrowhead. Bring your hands together, and right when the arrow reaches your grasping hand, open the index finger and thumb to grab the shaft lightly. A lot of beginners will grip the arrow too tightly, and this is what happens. The arrow wants to lift up, and that will pop it off the string when you're trying to lock. Light touch on that arrow, okay? Now, once your hand is up with the arrow, slide your draw hand down the shaft back to the nock, and when it gets there, do 2 things. Close the middle finger into the palm, and spin the arrow if needed to make sure the nock is aligned with the string. Don't look at it, learn to do it by feel. Now, I've switched hands and changed the angle here a bit so you can see better what happens with the string. Using your index finger and thumb, push the arrow forward so the string slips between the thumb and shaft. We'll do that again. Now, nock the arrow and quickly lock onto the arrow and string. Let's really look at how the draw hand should work with the arrow. Notice how my thumb is away from my hand to make that little opening discussed in the guide. That's really important. Don't close your thumb up against the hand like you're trying to squeeze the arrow. You'll ruin the lock and cause problems later. Keep that space open. You'll also notice the string ends up parallel to the line of my thumb joint. A quick note here. If you find your arrow is slipping up and down your string when you're trying to lock on it and you're sure your grasping hand isn't the problem, you have a couple of choices for how to fix that. You can find nocks that are thinner internally, or you can have a thicker serving put on your bow that matches the nocks you have, or you can have a nocking point put on your string. Now, I personally am not going to use a nocking point because there isn't any reference to them in the original manuscript, but that's only my personal preference, and I encourage you to use whatever helps you. I'm actually teaching this style to my 2 young kids, and they have nocking points. However you solve the problem is completely up to you. Now that you've locked on your first arrow, let's cover another important point about the thumb lock and a potentially serious fault you can commit here. Because the index finger is meant to press lightly against the shaft, the arrow could really be loosed at any arbitrary angle under any circumstance, like jostling on a galloping horse or whatever. The thumb lock enabled all manner of mounted archery feats. However, there is a risk beginners must be aware of. The fault is called pinching the nock, and it comes from pressing too hard against the arrow. It can break nocks and will absolutely ruin your release and aiming later. To learn how to avoid it, tilt your bow and relax your draw hand. Figure out just how much pressure it takes to keep the arrow just against the arrow pass and never press any harder than that. This is going to take a lot of practice to get a feel for, but you've got to get it right. Okay, your arrow is nocked, your limbs are in the right position, and your draw hand has just the right amount of tension to it. Now, draw your arrow back to full, and as you do, reset the position of your grasping hand. Index finger goes back, thumb lays down. Check your draw length mark, check your form, and relax. Do not loose your arrow at this point. Let's do that again without all the interruptions this time. Okay? And one more time. Okay, let's add some thumb protection to this. I'm going to use a rigid ring for this. Go ahead and get it set, close those two fingers, and go for it. Okay, one more time. You'll notice the thumb has to open a bit more to get around the string when it has a ring or guard on it. And you may even find that a leather guard needs to be shortened a little bit to keep the tip out of the way of the nock. This definitely takes practice. At first, you're probably going to tangle the ring and the leather guard up with the nock quite a bit, but keep at it and you'll smooth it out. Nocking is so critical that it must be mastered before any other techniques are attempted. Mameluke talks about how an archer should be able to nock an arrow and bring it to full draw without ever taking their eyes off of the target in front of them. To that end, this is going to be something that you'll need to practice over and over again. Now, once you start to get the feel for it, you might think about practicing with your eyes closed to remove the temptation of looking at the arrow or the bow. Something to think about. Now, if you're like me and you'd like to be just as good on one side as you are the other, like the Mamluks were, you could practice on one side for a while and then swap the bow and the arrow in your belt. Or you could also skip the belt to save a little time and use an alternating method like I do. You can see how that just saves a little bit of time. Just remember, if you're going to use that technique, start with the arrow about 2/3 back from the arrowhead, and remember to keep your fists firm. Now, you may have noticed a few times before I got started, I had a bit of a different body position that looked like this. And I promise we're going to talk about that in a future video. Now, nocking is the kind of thing that you really need to practice a lot in order to gain and keep a good skill level at. Somewhere between 60 to 70 times per side per day is a pretty good goal. Alright, I'm off to go practice this myself. Remember, the written guide always has more detail, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments below. Thank you very much for your time watching and reading, and I'll see you next time.